can now take some time to answer questions. We do have a couple of questions from the audience that I'll briefly ask first. And if anyone else in the audience has any questions, please feel free to take the opportunity here to engage with these wonderful scholars. So Jessica Zhu says, Dr. Long, I greatly appreciate your bringing Whitehead into the conversation. I'd like to hear more about your strategic use of Whiteheadian process philosophy. Also, can you comment on future directions? I know for sure Whitehead is not the only game in town. In Greek traditions, we have Heraclitus, Thales, Confucian, and Taoist traditions are also processual relational philosophy of action and practice. Many Buddhist traditions, and after Whitehead, we have Christian processual theology. And then comments, any chance we hold a conference about processual philosophy, theology, and world religions and philosophy's perspective? Yes, sure, let's do that too. Yeah, but please, go ahead, go ahead.
Okay, I'll say a little bit about this, and thank you for the question. But I just want to say I think that Professor Mundra's presentation was brilliant, and I really enjoyed it, and so really appreciate his work. So in regard to Whitehead, um, at least going way back to my dissertation, right? Because I did this kind of little thing, how did I become interested in Jain philosophy and so on. Um, One of the things about Whitehead's philosophy, I think one of the things that most captured my imagination was that it is very good at synthesizing and incorporating dualities, right? And this is what we see in the Jain tradition as well. You have this on the one hand, on the other kind of thing. Um, Transcendence and immanence of the divine, the preeminence of change and process, or the preeminence of the eternal, the static, the unchanging. What it actually incorporates, he manages to assimilate these various dualities in a very creative way. And what he was trying to do, it was actually quite a brilliant thing. He saw himself as actually returning back to the philosophy of Plato and essentially doing the thought experiment. What if Plato knew about Einstein and quantum theory, right? What if Plato lived today and knew the natural world as we now know it? How might he formulate his philosophy? And Whitehead essentially tries to create that. And then, of course, building on his thought, there's been a whole several generations now of process thinkers. Charles Hartshorne, Franklin Gamwell, who was my teacher, and then, of course, you have the California crowd, David Griffin and John Cobb, and what they're doing, what they've done with process thought, is show it as an approach to philosophical questions that can cross boundaries and again address and incorporate dichotomies in a non-reductive way. And so this is why you've seen, I think, Whiteheadians at the forefront of religion and science conversations, but also interfaith conversations. And if you're interested in Whiteheadian approaches from different religious traditions, I really recommend David Griffin's edited volume, Deep Religious Pluralism, where a variety of thinkers, each representing different religious traditions, um, came to pluralistic conclusions and utilizing Whitehead in the process. So much more could be said about that, but I know our time's limited.
Thank you, Professor Long. It sounds like, as the question also suggests, a potential conference in the making. Appreciate that
Hmm.
very much. There's also a question here for from Ayan Siddiqui, one of our graduate students here at Arihant Institute. It says, Jai Janendra, Professor Mundra, how would Jain understanding of duality face the arguments of Advaita Vedanta? Did you want to briefly comment on that?
Yeah, so in term so the what I showed was, one way that one Jain is facing the conclusions of Advaita Vedanta, this not the non-dualistic conclusion, and saying that basically that this can be useful pragmatically, can be useful for loosening attachment, and attaining liberation, but not actually true. That this non-duality is not actually the way the world is. Now, what so so it's again allow an allowance of its usefulness, but not its truth. What Haribhadra, now when Haribhadra actually addresses the arguments that they make, that various kinds of Advaitins, and he's often, his arguments are not so much directed to Advaita Vedanta, but other kinds of Advaitins like Brahma, Shabda Brahma Advaitins. So these basically grammarians like Bhartrhari, who are kind of these sort of like pre-Vedantins, sort of proto-Advaitas, or I mean Advaitas of some kind, and also Buddhist Advaitas, Buddhist non-dualists like these Chittamatra mind only, Yogacara Buddhists. The general approach is to say that if you are saying everything is one, you can't account for a difference. And then now the response usually, and that we see difference everywhere. And in fact, not only do we empirically experience difference, but we need to we need to maintain difference in mind in order to talk about the path to liberation or anything that we want to talk about at all, including the most important things that we want to talk about. Like the difference between bondage and liberation, or the difference between suffering and not suffering, or whatever. So, but then the usual response actually, and this is a really interesting thing that I think that needs a lot more. This has been a topic of some discussion amongst Jain philosophers, and it needs a lot more work. And there's some really good work that especially my colleague Janesh Shet is doing on the Nishchaya Vyavahara thing, sort of conventional and absolute reality that Professor Long mentioned is very important in Kunda Kunda. That is, I mean, some people argue that Advaitins, so the usual response of Advaitins and non-dualist Buddhists to a criticism like Haribhadra Suri's is, well, yeah, yes, of course there are differences on a conventional level, but at an absolute level, those differences disappear. And Haribhadra says that is not an intelligible way to do anything, because what is this absolute level that you're talking about? If you have any way of knowing this absolute level, if you do, then it should be applicable to the empirical level, or and vice versa. Haribhadra just doesn't think that distinction makes sense. Now, of course, that is a distinction that some Jains do think makes sense, and this is where you see there is plurality within Anekantavada. It's not just one thing. And so, as I said, this is a topic for much further research to understand, how this ultimate and conventional distinction works vis-a-vis Anekantavada.
Yeah, I appreciate that so much, Professor Mundra. Plurality within Anekantavada. I think that's one of the things we're trying to showcase in this conference, as a matter of fact. So I really appreciate that comment to kind of summarize what you just said. And I also just am realizing and remembering that the term that we're using, engaged Anekantavada, is the title of Jeffery Long's chapter in our new volume, Engaged Jainism, which you had a chance to read, Professor Mundra, as well. And that's really what we're doing. We're looking at the very many manifestations of the way that Anekantavada has been and is being used, and we'll see more tomorrow when the Jain community members come to speak as well. So thank you both for going over that. I wanted to quickly pivot maybe now to Professor Long, just to ask a question. You mentioned a lot about Ramakrishna and his, not so much, I guess, a lack of engagement directly with Anekantavada. And I was wondering if Vivekananda had any particular engagements that you're aware of, because I know he did interact a bit more with the Jains, right? Compared to
Yes.
Ramakrishna. Is there anything you'd want to say about that?
Unfortunately, and I say this with some embarrassment, the Swami Vivekananda was a little bit critical of the Jain monks that he encountered in his wanderings in India. Um, he, um, how would I put this? Um, he did maybe you could see his perspective well by way of comparison with what is often attributed to the Buddha, that he thought the very strict practices of ahimsa, the extreme self-deprivation that he saw, he didn't think was necessary, right, for the attainment of realization. So he was critical of that in some respects. I I would like to think that he had more meaningful engagement with the Jains, and maybe, or had he had more meaningful engagement, he would have come to similar conclusions. He himself uses the phrase many-sidedness often in his complete works when talking about pluralism. But the problem is we just don't have the data. We don't have him talking about it or much of it. I mean, the Jain tradition is barely mentioned in the complete works, and in fact, sometimes, in fact, the ascetics he may be talking about may not even be Jain. We can make an inference that they might be, but there are also various Hindu sampradayas that practice is severe bodily mortification and so on. And it was that generally that he was not favorable toward. So yeah, I wish there was some wonderful quote where he talked about where he was you're putting Mahavira there in the conversation with Buddha and Christ, but we just don't have it. I think a lot of times that was a function of his audience too. Now, of course, he and Virchan Gandhi shared the same stage. I would love to have been a fly on the wall if they were having some conversation, but we just don't have any record of that.
Yeah, thank you. And in fact, when I asked that question, I was thinking exactly of that. What were his conversations with Virchand Gandhi, and perhaps the influence of him using that language, as you mentioned, had come from that encounter? And I don't know that, but that was more kind of what I had in mind. So thank you.
I
Yeah.
would like to think so. And I think one thing I really appreciated about Dr. Barbato's introduction to this comparative theological venture is that we're not only engaging with texts, we're engaging with living traditions and communities. And so I like to think that for some of these questions, it's kind of left to us to do the creative activity of forming those linkages and saying, well, okay, Swami Vivekananda doesn't talk about Jainism, but uh, knowing other things that he said and knowing other things we know about the Jain tradition, what fruitful thing might we draw out of that? And so, that's why I really am a big believer in this kind of constructive mode of scholarship, in addition to, the kind of careful work of looking at texts and kind of what we do more conventionally.
Yeah, it's very much in the spirit of Anekantavada, isn't it? Yeah,
It is.
thank you.
Yes.
That's easy to say in this conference because that's what we're doing. Thank you, Professor Long. And I wondered maybe if Professor Mundra wanted to answer this last question from Soham Shah. I think it relates to what you were saying before. It says, Jai Janendra, he's one of our graduate students as well. Is the tension between dualism and non-dualism best understood as a contradiction or as a limitation of language and perception? Could both positions be pointing toward a reality that cannot be fully captured by ordinary categories of self and other, unity and plurality, or subject and object, etc.? Could the ultimate experience at the end of the day be the same? So your elevator answer to that.
Yeah, certainly could be. And that I think is exactly what Buddhist and Hindu non-dualists generally say, It's a finger, this is all fingers pointing at the moon, not the moon itself. Um, uh, and maybe that's what Kunda Kunda wants to say too. Again, I think this is something that really needs to be understood better about Kunda Kunda. Um, this is not something that Haribhadra ever says. And he, in fact, repudiates exactly this proposition. Now, someone could say, yeah, but he's still using language, and when he's having all these arguments and everything, and he, in fact, is very, very insistent, Haribhadra himself, and this is, and as I say, I mean, this is Haribhadra is very influential, and he's very, he really sets the terms. He's a really a largely looming figure, sets the terms for a certain stream of Jain philosophy, particularly on the Shvetamrita side. And so he and many like him really emphasize Vyavahara, that is empirical, transactions, everyday experience. And he tends to not think that there is sort of, some ineffable experience that is beyond the normal everyday and language. At least he doesn't, he says that. He makes a lot of arguments, but all those arguments are in language. And so someone could say, well, Haribhadra is just saying all this stuff at the empirical level, but he's leaving open whether there is something, some experience beyond that. And there would be no way for, I think, anyone to refute that because any refutation would be within language. So don't know what to say about that. And I don't think anyone can know what to say about that because stipulatively we're not supposed to be saying anything about it.
Mhm. Can I ask a quick question to Professor Mundra?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
So yes, so yeah, Anil, at least according to the hagiographies on Haribhadra, he did not start off his life as a Jain. He came from what would today be called a Hindu background. Do you
Yeah.
think his ability to treat Hindu sources with such generosity, right, while critiquing things, but then saying, well, this could have a use and so on. Do you, I mean, this is speculative, but do you think this comes just from did he just have a very broad-minded and generous personality, or could it be
Yeah.
because he grew up with those arguments and was familiar with why they were held?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think it's probably got to be a bit of both, you know. It's I mean, it's you know, he's very he's totally he's kind of merciless. Like it's not that he's just like, cool for everybody to say whatever. Like he's a really a merciless critic. But
Mhm.
he as we've seen in some of the ways we've seen, he is willing to he does want to take certain, great thinkers, allow that they were great thinkers and that they should be taken seriously. And he seems to have been conversing with them. So broad-minded as you say, in that sense, and also is clearly very deeply conversant in a way that probably is evidence for him having been raised in a Brahminical milieu, but also he's actually more than anything is conversant with Buddhism, and that's not unusual for thinkers of his period anyway. They're all really very deeply conversant with each other, and so this is a milieu in which people know each other's ideas really well and are taking them really seriously.
Thank you very much.
Thank you both.
Thank you both, Professor Jeffrey Long and Professor Neil Mundra, for a great first panel here and kicking us off in such a good spirit. We're already seeing the diversity of Anekantavada itself through these two presentations, and I'm sure that that will continue. So thank you both for taking the time to share this wisdom and knowledge with us and for being with us. I know you're both very busy.